Start talking about food chains. And a food chain is just a pathway that we use to show how energy is being transferred from one organism to another. All right, so it's kind of like it's a roadmap of this is where the energy is going. Now, the thing about a food chain, though, it's a linear pathway. Okay, and if you think of an actual chain, you can actually picture what a chain looks like. You have a bunch of links that are all connected together. Okay, it's a linear pathway. Each link represents what's called a trophic level. A trophic level is just kind of like your position in the sequence. You're the first link, second, third, last, whatever. That's what a trophic level is. I think of trophic level as your feeding level. Like, where do you feed in this food chain? What part are you at? Are you near the bottom where a lot of things are eating you, or are you near the top where nothing's eating you? Yeah.
So we'd be at the top?
Yes. Each organism in a food chain provides food, therefore energy, for the level above it, the next level higher than it. So here we have a typical or a very simple aquatic food chain where we have plankton. They're the first link in the food chain. And then you have these organisms called zooplankton. They're the second link in the food chain. Then you have these fish larvae, which is the third. Small fish is the fourth. And this top predator shark is the fifth. All right, so there's our simple food chain. Food chain links, there's overlaps 4 different places. There's 4 links in this food chain. So energy comes into the food chain here and travels down this linear pathway, and so our arrow would point in this direction if we're using arrows to represent the food chain. Okay? Now with food chains, notice that you see a producer, like the plankton's our producer. You see some consumers, you see a carnivore. Maybe the small fish might be an omnivore. We don't know based on what the picture shows us. But what we don't see often in food chains are detritivores. Does anybody have an idea of why a detritivore is difficult to place in a food chain?
Because they'll eat anything pretty much.
Yeah, they'll get their energy from almost every level. Like, a detritivore could feed on a dead shark. Whereas a detritivore could also feed on fish larvae that die. So it's hard to tell where they fit in the chain because they could feed at every level of the chain because everything eventually dies and needs to be decomposed. Or a scavenger can come around and eat whatever is left over. Here's another example. Here's a meadow ecosystem where you have a sunflower. That's our producer. They are the energy harvesting member of the food chain. They're the ones that capture sunlight energy and convert it into sugars for the rest of the food chain. So these producers are always found at the very beginning. Okay, they are the base or the start of our food chain. Next would be a caterpillar eating sunflower leaves. Okay, he'd be a consumer. What kind of consumer do you think a caterpillar is? Is it a herbivore, omnivore, carnivore? Probably a herbivore. I don't think we have many carnivorous caterpillars. So there could be. You never know. Could be. Blackbird eats the caterpillar. It's also a consumer. What kind of consumer do you think this is? Could be an omnivore. Eating a caterpillar would be eating another consumer, but could blackbirds maybe eat like berries or something like that, or nuts or seeds? Yeah, potentially. We don't really know much about his diet based on the food chain, so we'd have to take a guess to see if it's an omnivore. What about a fox? Fox eats the blackbird. Most likely probably a carnivore. And then, again, bacteria, fungi, they feed at every level. They can feed here, they can feed here, they can feed here, they can even feed there. So they don't have a good spot in the linkage of a food chain because they feed at every level, or have the potential to feed at every level. They're kind of outside the food chain, in a sense. Now, only some of the energy and some of the matter is going to be transferred each step of a food chain. Not everything goes through. It's focusing on energy, and every step of the food chain, some of the energy is lost. That's a very important concept, because this actually limits how long the chain can be. Because eventually you're going to run out of energy. We lose energy because of other purposes like metabolism, the breakdown and building of molecules in our body require energy, and simple heat loss to the environment. Think of our bodies kind of like an engine. As all these chemical reactions are taking place, heat is being generated, and that heat just radiates away from us. Just as a car engine, as the car engine's parts move around and do their thing of moving the car, heat is generated and the engine gets really, really hot. That is lost energy. That energy is being given away. It's not doing anything. It's not doing any work. So it's considered loss. So because of energy loss, food chains generally only have about 4 links. And that's a general number. It's not an exact number. Some food chains could be shorter. Some could be longer. But if you're to average them out, usually they're about 4 links to a food chain. And so you can see here, even plants don't absorb all the possible sunlight. A lot of that light's reflected. A lot of that light actually heats up the leaf and doesn't do anything. So about 10% of the energy the sun gives off is actually taken in by plants. That mouse only gets 1% of that energy. And then the hawk that eats the mouse only gets 1% of that energy. 10%. 10% of 1% is 0.1. And then the mushroom only gets 0.01% of that original energy. We'll talk more about those numbers in a little bit. But energy is lost. It does limit the length of our food chain. All right, so this kind of puts some actual terminology to it. So we've already talked a lot about autotrophs. We've called them producers. Sometimes we'll see them as primary producers because they are the source for all the organic molecules and the energy for the food chain. The next step would be your primary consumers. They feed directly on producers. These are your herbivores, for example. A herbivore has to be a primary consumer because by definition, a herbivore feeds on producers. Okay? What else could be a primary consumer besides a herbivore? An omnivore. Could be. Depends on what he's eating that day. Yeah? Detrivore could be considered, again, they fit kind of outside the food chain, so they could also be considered a primary consumer. Secondary means the second consumer feed directly on the primary consumers. These are your carnivores. They eat only meat. But again, what else could be a secondary consumer? Omnivores. We could be a secondary consumer if we're eating a chicken for dinner, or we could be a primary consumer if we're eating salad for dinner. Depends on what you're eating at the time. And then finally, third level consumers most likely are carnivores, but they feed on secondary consumers. And that's about where we get. You could get to a fourth level. We'd call it a quaternary consumer. But you don't usually get past that. Again, there's not enough energy to get up that high. We'll talk why in a little bit. Yeah?
So that ocean chain that we big, but is that normal? Or is that just because it's the ocean?
I mean, there are some that can get to 5 levels. Just not that picture or that slide I showed. I want to, you guys pay special attention to the direction these arrows point. People often get this wrong. We're doing an activity tomorrow where you guys are going to be creating food chains and food webs, and a lot of times people put the arrow the wrong way. They think the arrow shows what's eating what, not the direction of energy flow. Think of it, what's being eaten. The producer is being eaten by the primary consumer, so the arrow goes from producer to primary consumer. The arrow points the direction of energy flow. Now, this is a food web. A food web is basically a bunch of food chains that are kind of interacting with each other. It gives us a better picture of what's really going on in that ecosystem. It's not just one linear pathway that energy flows. It flows in all different pathways. Most organisms eat more than one kind of food. They get their energy from more than one source, unless you're like a koala bear that only eats eucalyptus leaves. All right? Most organisms have a bigger variety of food they eat. So you could be a different level depending on what path you take. Let's take a look at this example. We'll start here with plants. And we'll go to the seed-eating bird. To the... we'll go from plants to the herbaceous insect to the spider. What level would that spider be then? Who can tell me what level that would be? Yeah, Paige.
Second level?
Secondary consumer. Okay? Because this is the primary consumer, and this is your producer. Now what if we went this direction? Change color here. Let's go from plant, herbaceous insect, predaceous insect, to spider. What's the spider now? Sherry?
Tertiary consumer.
Now a tertiary consumer. Okay, so that just because you're one level in one food chain doesn't mean you're a different level in a different food chain. All right? So food webs get a lot more complicated, and then you get things like this, or you get the spiders that can eat predaceous insects, and the predaceous insects that can eat spiders. It gets, you would think it'd be never-ending, but it doesn't really work out that way. But food webs are a lot more complicated because energy doesn't really flow in just one direction. It flows in multiple directions. But the key is we never see arrows pointing back to the producers. Energy is not going back to the plants. Energy only flows one direction. Just a couple more definitions. We've already talked about these, though. Again, omnivores are a very special case. They may be primary, secondary, or even tertiary, depending on what they're eating at the time. They can feed on all different levels. So can scavengers, and so can decomposers. They don't have one distinct spot in the food chain or a food web. Now, energy flow is not going to be efficient. We've already talked about that. In fact, scientists have come up with this thing called the 10% rule. That only about 10 to 20% moves from one trophic level to the next. So let's take a look at this caterpillar situation here. Here we have a caterpillar, and it consumes 200 joules of energy from eating leaves. Well, 100 joules of that 200 is going to be given off as waste. That's the feces. That's just waste product that's not digestible, and the caterpillar gets rid of it. 67 joules go to cell respiration, using that energy to get things done. Only about 33 joules, not sure what percent that is, goes into growth, and that can be consumed by another organism. The new cells that were made, the storage of molecules. Okay, so not all the energy can be transferred. Only a fraction of it. In fact, roughly 10% of it moves from one level to the next. So much of the energy that we consume is actually going to be used to do things, to be alive. Our metabolism, certain life processes need to take place. That's actually why we eat in the first place. That's where most of the energy goes. Another reason for energy loss, though, is that many organisms are simply not eaten. You think of like a field of grass. All those blades of grass are all photosynthesizing, making energy, usable by other organisms. But do all the plants get eaten? Every single blade of grass? No. So some of that energy is just going to die and go to decomposers once those plants die. It's not going to be transferred to the next level. Some organisms simply survive and don't ever get eaten. Then some parts of the organism can't be broken down, like wood, bones, teeth, beaks, shells. Non-digestible materials. It took energy to build that stuff. So The organism used energy to make the bones, make the shell, make the beak, but the organism that eats it can't digest it. Did you guys do owl pellets in middle school? You look for the bones and stuff? Elementary school? Okay. The bones and the hair obviously were not digested by the owl, and he just spit it back up to make room in his stomach for more food. But those bones, that hair, does have energy in it, just not energy that owl could get out. And so those are other reasons why energy is not transferred to other levels. All right, let's do some questions. On the base, and something really small on the top. So we can look at biomass, for example. Biomass is the mass of all the organic material at a trophic level. So if you took all the producers, all the plants, put them on a scale, that would be the biomass of that producer level. Took all the grasshoppers, and you could find their biomass. Okay, it's more of a theoretical number because we really can't do it accurately, but the producer would have the most biomass. After all, they're the ones that are converting carbon dioxide into biomass. They're making the sugars, making the organic compounds. Okay? Energy flow. We just talked about that. If plants are getting all the energy from the sun, and that some of that energy is being lost as we move up the ecosystem, up the trophic levels, the energy gets less and less available as we move towards the top. What's also interesting is the number of individuals. We'll talk more about this a little bit later in a few slides, but if you were to count up all the producers in an area, they would outnumber the number of primary consumers, who would outnumber the number of secondary consumers, who would outnumber the tertiary consumers. You have very few top predators compared to members below them. Yes, Lindsay?
Oh, I have a question. Who are top predators?
So, in most ecological pyramids, there are fewer organisms that occupy each trophic level as you move up. For example, look at a meadow covered in grass. If you were to count every single blade of grass, you would have a lot of individual organisms. You probably would not have as many mice and insects as every blade of grass. Just like you wouldn't have as many snakes and robins as you would have mice and insects. Why do you think this is? Yeah.
Because sounds like each group is getting only 10% of the energy they need to consume in order to get this full energy.
Exactly. If we're losing energy as we move up, if we're moving up the food pyramid, if we're moving up that ecological pyramid, we're losing all this energy. Top level consumers have to eat a lot of consumers underneath them to get the energy they need to survive. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio, like one hawk eats one mouse. One hawk probably has to eat like 10 mice to get enough energy to survive. And that's why you get less and less organisms as you move up. So here's a good visual of it. So if we had, let's just look at this right here. If we have 10,000 joules of energy that were converted by the primary producers, only 10% move up to primary consumers. Okay, that's a 10% transfer of energy. Only 10% of this move up to here. So of the original 10,000 joules, what percentage are we at now? Yeah.
1.
I think it's 0.1. Am I right? Is it 0.1?
Yeah. No, 1%?
I think
No, of the original.
Of the original.
That's right, never mind.
Okay? And so it's always based of the original energy. So of this 10,000 joules, we only have 100 joules left here. By the time we get up to the snake, there's only 10 of those joules left for the snake to consume. So the snake has to consume lots of mice, which has to consume lots of grasshoppers, which has to consume lots of plants to get their energy. Right, which takes lots of sunlight. So the number of organisms at each trophic level is proportional to the amount of biomass and the amount of energy. at the level below it. So in reality, it's the resources that determine how much life the environment can support. It's how much sunlight there is, and how many plants there are. That determines how many organisms can survive in that area. Was it 1%?
I think so.
Okay, you're probably right. I probably just couldn't do the math.
Like on the pyramid, it goes to from 10
Yeah.
to 1.
So what are some of these primary resources we might be talking about? Some primary resources that plants might need to be good producers. Water for photosynthesis. What else? Sunlight. And probably minerals and so forth too, but those are the two big ones. So think of places in this world that would have lots of water and lots of sunlight. What might be an ecosystem that has that? Kevin?
Oh, tropical rain.
Tropical rainforests. And those places have lots of what we call biodiversity, lots of different organisms all surviving in one place. Let's think about places on this planet that might be limiting in water or sunlight. Desert has lots of sunlight, but because it doesn't have a lot of water, there's not a lot of plant life to support a really lush ecosystem. So on.
Also like caves.
Okay, caves. All right, definitely not many plants living in caves, so there's not very big ecosystems in caves. Neil. Antarctica. Even in the summer, there's not a lot of. Why? There's tons of water there though. Why is it not?
It's frozen.
All the water's frozen. Right. Same with the tundra. You could have lots of sunlight, but in a tundra there's all this frozen water, and you don't get enough photosynthesis. You don't get enough resources. Yes, Lindsay.
What about like anywhere at the equator?
Depends on how much water is available.
Or Russia?
Again, lots of water, most of it's frozen. All right, so you guys can watch this video if you want on your own. It's on energy flows from that Crash Course YouTube channel. But we got another question, so go ahead.